Yeah, welcome to this podcast. We are delighted to be joined by Professor Claudia Williamson, who is Probasco Distinguished Chair of Free Enterprise and a Professor of Economics at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She is also the Director of the Center for Economic Education. Her main research interests lie at the intersection of applied economic development and political economy. She serves as the editor of the Journal of Institutional Economics and is on the editorial board of Public Choice and is the current president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education. She has also served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Mississippi Advisory Committee and is on the board of fellows for the Institute of American Civics. Professor Williamson has authored over 50 articles in referred journals, including the Journal of Law and Economics, World Development, Journal of Comparative Economics, Public Choice, Journal of Corporate Finance, and the Journal of Institutional Economics. She has co-edited 2 books, contributed multiple chapters to edited books, written book reviews and policy briefs. Professor Williamson's research has also appeared in popular press outlets such as The Economist and the BBC. And according to Google Scholars, her work has been cited over 3,200 times in top journals, including the American Economic Review, American Political Science Review, and Journal of Economic Growth. Welcome to this podcast, Professor Williamson.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for doing this, Professor. So I would start by asking you some personal questions, which is linked to where you were raised in the US and then what motivated you to study economics at the undergrad level and then go on to pursue a PhD in economics. Yes, Professor.
So I grew up in West Virginia, which is a rural state, and it is one of the poorest states in the country. And so having, I think, growing up in an area where you can see poverty, different income levels, and growing up also bordering a state that is not that poor. So growing up in West Virginia, we were on the border of Ohio, which is a relatively higher income state. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that I would see different businesses and entrepreneurship happening in Ohio, which is, 2 miles from where I'm growing up. But then in West Virginia, there's still a lot more poverty and lower levels of income, lack of business development, lack of growth. And so I think from a really early age, I was always puzzled and curious about, well, what's creating these differences? And it wasn't until I got to college that I took my first economics class. So I didn't know that economics was a field or something that you studied, or I had no idea, had not been exposed to it. And once I realized that there's a whole discipline and a whole history of academics and scholars talking about these issues, I was fascinated and immediately drawn to the subject. And it was within that first semester of taking my first economics class as an undergrad that I knew I wanted to pursue my PhD. And I was just completely hooked by the economic way of thinking. It was something that I wanted to study. So that's more of how I would think of it. And even now I view myself as a student of economics. And it was so intriguing, and it offered the tools to at least help start answering those questions that I had really early on growing up again in a relatively poor part of a country that is very wealthy. It's like, okay, well, if we were within the same country, what can start to explain these income differences? And then I started thinking of it much more globally as, well, what explains why some countries are rich and some are poor? Yeah. And then that's what I started in my graduate studies, studying and writing my dissertation on, and then subsequent papers.
Okay. So why did you go to West Virginia University in particular? Professor?
Some of it is I was naive. I didn't realize that, it mattered where you went to school, even as an undergraduate, in terms of, just professional development, networking, and opportunities once you graduate. So I'm a first-generation college student. My parents did not go to college. Actually, no one on either side of our family had gone to college. I have an older sister, and she was in college at Marshall. So she was the first one to go. And so that's also then where I went for my undergraduate degree. And I did apply to a couple other schools for graduate studies from the PhD program, but it's, from West Virginia, and why not go there? And they gave me, actually the best offer. So it also worked out in terms of where I just ended up. I'm very thankful that that's where I went because of people I met, fellow graduate students, and then also professors there. So I'm glad that it worked out that way, but it was no foresight. It was kind of accidental, and I was somewhat naive in the way that you should have approached graduate school.
Yeah, so that leads me to ask you, any professor at West Virginia University that left an indelible impression on you as you began your professional career as an economist?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I can start with talking about my dissertation advisor, Peter Leeson. And so he went to George Mason University for his PhD and studied under, it's in Virginia, yes. So it's actually, it is close. So he studied under Peter Bettke. And then when I was a first-year graduate student, West Virginia hired him as an assistant professor. And so Pete came and he had a lot of work in development. And so it was a natural fit in terms of our research, his approach to economics, his approach to research, extremely productive. He was engaging. He, was just excited, on fire. He still is for economic ideas. And so he has left a huge just imprint professionally and personally. I'm great friends with him and his wife. And so, that's one of those, just overlaps in terms of that's exactly where I was supposed to be at that time. I also, Chris Coyne ended up being a professor at West Virginia University, also a graduate of George Mason. So I was very much influenced from the Austrian kind of George Mason way of thinking from them. And since then I've had interactions with George Mason professors, including Peter Bettke. And then another professor who was at West Virginia at the time was Russ Sobel. And so Professor Sobel, much more public choice and, entrepreneurship. And so that's who I took classes from as well. He very influential and, just teaching us, also highly productive and interested in shaping us, getting us just where we should be as PhD students to be great teachers. But all of those that I mentioned are excellent teachers, but then also great researchers.
So your interest in institutions were sort of coming from, these two professors, or you had some interest and then these professors sort of ignited it further? I'll get to institutions in the second half, but then, just out of curiosity, I'm asking you this.
So about what, in terms of
interest in institutions in particular?
Yes. So running through kind of Austrian economics, public choice economics is, I would argue, what we now consider new institutional economics, or basically what you're doing is that you're trying to understand how the rules matter. How does rules and regulations shape human behavior? And so you see that in public choice, which is applying the economic way of thinking to politics. And so within public choice, you'll say, well, trying to understand why there's certain types of political behavior or voting behavior. Well, that's all about the rules. It's all about the institutions. And then within Austrian economics, the big kind of classic debate that, if people are familiar with Austrian economics, is the socialist calculation debate. Well, that's all about the rules. That's whether or not you have private property over the means of production, or do you have public ownership of the means of production? So socialism versus capitalism. And that is about understanding the rules and institutions that then set up certain behaviors that then dictate the economic outcomes that we observe.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. So now, the director of the UTC, Center for Economic Education, Professor. So why don't you tell us about your roles and responsibilities in your current role, Professor Williamson?
Yes, so I am what's called the Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And of course, that includes being a regular professor, teaching economics, and doing research. But what it also includes is being the director of the Center for Economic Education. And so largely the mission of that center is to train the teachers at the high school and middle school level.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've been able to do is create and offer workshops that's teaching teachers how to explain economics to middle school and high school students. So in Tennessee, our state curriculum dictates that students have exposure to certain economic ideas such as supply and demand, but we don't have a set alone economics class. And so oftentimes that material is covered by a history teacher or a civics teacher who has never had any exposure to economics, let alone training on how you teach it. And so that's a lot of what that center and I'm trying to do is to help teachers at the high school level and even middle school teach their students the economic way of thinking.
Yeah. So is there any plans of actually directly, teaching the school students? Is that the plan also, Professor?
That would be great. Hopefully at some point in the future, we're able to expand and go directly into high schools and teach the students or even offer them some summer programs where they can come to UTC's campus and have exposure to, economic literacy, personal finance even, and just really get them thinking about these ideas in a way that's, based on the economic way of thinking. And what we can do is just let them know that the issues they may be grappling with, there's actually useful tools within economics to help them answer and think about those questions.
So how do these teachers, take these trainings? I'm just, curious to know this. Like, how do they, because these teachers are not trained in economics, right?
Correct.
Yes.
So some of them could have been, but the ones that usually sign up to take the classes have not. And so they come to campus and we do like face-to-face training. I started this during COVID, so we have done some Zoom offerings, but we just, as most of us have found that's probably not as effective, especially for teaching.
Yeah. It's not effective. So, that brings me, to the next question. So, why do you think school students, need to be made aware of economic, concepts and, how to think like an economist? And, any positive, spillovers of doing this in a free market capitalist economy, that you might want to highlight here, Professor Williamson?
Sure.
Because they are actually in the formative stage of their career, right? Very novice, in their way of thinking.
They're thinking of, they're being exposed to so many different things, and they're also thinking about what paths to go down for their own career. But why economics is so great is that they can choose something completely outside of economics as their major or where they, go with their life in the future, but it is extremely helpful as an everyday citizen, as an everyday person. And so when we think about economics, what economics is that it is the study of human behavior or human choices. And so it's much more in that sense a social science when we're trying to understand why people do what they do, the choices that they make. And all of us at some point struggle with that, whether it's with relationships or in our personal life or family life, is why are people behaving this way? And so what economics does is it provides a very useful framework and with some key assumptions that can kind of help illuminate and provide answers to those questions that people might have. So for example, we talk about that people respond to incentives and that every decision has a trade-off or what we call an opportunity cost. And so just even those two kind of basic concepts, once you teach it to somebody, it becomes very powerful because they start filtering their own decisions and other people's decisions kind of through that framework. And at least to me personally, it became very helpful just to understand other people or understand myself. Now, when we think about it, also then applying it to things that are happening in the world. So right now we're seeing in the U.S., for example, higher than normal inflation for us. And so many students are confused or puzzled by that. And, what economics does is quite easily can provide some basic answers to questions that they seem, or maybe they think is just too difficult to understand when you just put it in the economic way of thinking. So again, understand that individuals are rational, that we respond to incentives, that we face trade-offs, then that helps to kind of put the world in context. And so specifically, you mentioned about, free market capitalism.
Yeah.
So capitalism is really about property rights.
Yeah.
And so is it private ownership of the means of production, or is it public ownership of the means of production? And so I always make sure to make that very clear when I'm teaching economics, whether if I'm talking to someone at the high school level or at the college level, because there's so much confusion around the word capitalism, and that's all it means. So basically private property rights versus, public ownership, but it has very powerful consequences.
Yes.
In a free market capitalist society, what we mean is that you're allowed to own land. You're allowed to privately, own a business.
Yes.
You're allowed to decide where you work, if you work, how many hours you work. Whereas in a socialist system, those things are not free choices for you.
Yes.
And so that's a huge distinction. Once students understand that distinction and then the consequences of it, I think that it's not that hard to get them to think in those terms, to see the benefit of free markets and how, for example, they want to be able to own their iPhone. They don't like it when their parents take it away from them. They're not going to like it if the government says, no, that's my property now.
Yes. Yes. And so, these students, do they also understand that, going forward, they also need to acquire skills which are more relevant, for the job market, like, take up STEM courses, as they enter college, these kind of decisions?
There's what we call a skills gap in the US in terms of what's really in demand. And so trade schools are actually very much in demand in the sense of having great job market prospects. And so being, a mechanic or an electrician or plumber, those skills have been decreasing. And so there's fewer people who know how to do those things. And so instead of, I would argue, pushing students to a traditional 4-year degree, it's people should think about, what are they naturally interested in, and what are they naturally good at? And that might not be something that you find at a 4-year college. It may be something that you find at a trade school or through an associate's degree. And I think that we should absolutely be encouraging that. And overall, it's just, here are things that maybe you would like, and you're also possibly good at it. Why would you not pursue that?
Yes. Yeah. So, so the institutions, actually, talked, what institutions are in the framework of, capitalism. And so why do you think, Professor, that, they matter for economic growth in the long run in institutions?
So when we talk about institutions, specifically property rights, and trying to understand their relation to economic development in the long run, again, we got to come back to, basically the consequences that those types of systems set up. So if we think about private property rights, what that means is that there's a separation between mine and thine, that there's an understanding of that at an informal cultural level, but then there's also protection and enforcement of rights and enforcement of contracts through some sort of court system, so the rule of law. Why that matters is it sets up incentives for exchange. And so we can think of it in kind of in a subsistence level barter type economy initially. And out of that grows incentives. I can grow a certain type of crop, and you can grow a different type of crop, and we can have more of everything. And then we exchange through that process, through the exchange process, which only happens when you have private property or a capitalist system. That's where you get prices. So the exchange ratios are our prices. Prices convey information about relative scarcity. And so this was, again, back to, I mentioned earlier, what we call the socialist calculation debate. That doesn't happen in a socialist system. So when a product or a resource becomes relatively more scarce, prices immediately adjust to reflect that. That's the beauty of the price system. Why that's so important is a profit and loss system emerges because of the information contained in prices. And notice I said loss as well as profit. Capitalism is not capitalism in, its system, its theoretical, basis is not about profit or business or preferring, capitalist in the term of the people owning capital. Capitalism is about property rights, which sets up prices that contain information about profit and loss.
Yes.
Profit is if there's a sector that's earning profit, what that conveys in a free market system
Yes.
is that's an area in which you're satisfying people's wants and
Yes.
you're doing it really well and they're willing to pay you for it. And that's
Yes.
beautiful.
Yes.
What it also does is it invites in competitors, which will
Yes.
eventually drive down the price and drive down your profit.
Yes.
What a loss conveys is that this entrepreneur or this business owner is creating a service or doing a service or selling a product that people no
Yes.
longer value,
Yes.
and it needs to go away.
Yes.
So that's, Schumpeter's creative destruction
Yes.
idea, that through that process
Yes.
is how we innovate.
Yes.
Through an entrepreneurial discovery process is
Yes.
how we get true economic growth.
Yes.
And through those competitive forces, we are actually encouraged and incentivized to serve one another.
Yes.
And that's, I think, kind of a missing part of the beauty of a capitalist system or a private property rights system.
So that sort of, very detailed, account of, the capitalist structure, also applies to emerging market economies, or do you think that there are other specific institutions in emerging market economies which sort of matter more for economic growth?
That's a great question. Overall, that kind of rundown that I gave, a brief kind of explanation of why private property rights matter so much for economic growth, applies across time and space. So anywhere, that we would be talking about it, it would equally apply. The differences come in whenever we talk about, well, how do you get private property rights? How do you have a true profit and loss system where you don't get government meddling and subsidizing certain businesses, or you have a bank fail and so your government subsidizes it. So we want to avoid the interference of profit and loss and the price signal that then again spurs innovation. And so emerging markets are in the situation of where they've overcome some of the biggest hurdles. They've been able to achieve growth, at least at some point.
Yes.
And they're possibly shifting toward freeing up their markets.
Yes.
I would just say that possibly the way in which you continue to secure property right and enforce contracts, for example, may look different than how it happened in the Western world historically.
Okay.
That's where some of my focus in my own research has looked at the importance of cultural norms.
Okay.
So in emerging markets, cultural norms could be quite different than, again, in historic Western societies. Maybe not, but they could be, and that's just something that needs to be taken into consideration.
Okay. Okay. So could you, Professor, give one example of one cultural norm which sort of differ, from a Western advanced economy perspective and, from an emerging market economy perspective? Yes, Professor.
So one possibility is this notion of cultural norm that we describe as individualism versus collectivism. And so individualism kind of describes cultural norms and kind of beliefs in individual responsibility, more of a separation between a preference of the individual over a group collective, whether it would be family or your religious group or an ethnic group, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Versus a collectivist norms tend to support the preference of a group. So again, preference of the well-being of your family or preference of some, religious group or ethnic group over the individual preference or individual success. And so where we see that mattering, and there's been a lot of work that has come out of economics in the last 15 years on trying to understand the importance of culture and specifically the importance of individualism versus collectivism, is individualistic cultures tend to align more with the private property rights culture. You tend to see more property rights institutions there, greater success with contract enforcement. You tend to see more innovation. You also see that individualistic cultures typically underpin democratic institutions. Okay. And so that's where I think it could matter. It depends on which country you're talking about, and it depends on where they tend to align on that individualism versus collectivist spectrum. Okay. Now, kind of the recent wave of research within the cultural literature is to understand how, let's say that you start freeing up your markets, how that feedback comes into changing your culture.
Okay.
And so perhaps by engaging in more free trade, for example, you would see more of a shift toward individualism and less of collectivist norms.
Okay. So that's, one aspect of, the institutions, that, is, linked to, economic growth. So there's a lot of, work on institutions done by Acemoglu at MIT. Correct, Professor Williamson?
Yes.
He's sort of, the godfather of institutions and, how it links to economic growth. So, they, have sort of, tended to argue that, the organization of society plays a critical role in helping creating a favorable atmosphere for wealth generation. So they sort of categorize institutional arrangement into two categories. One is that of extractive in nature, and the other being those categories that, very clearly delineate the property right. Some of that, which you have just highlighted here, which, delineating the property right is sort of, important. And you have other work in this area, which is, some of, I guess, your earlier works, which is informal institutions, rule, institutional arrangement and economic performance, which was published in Public Choice. So, Professor, could you just highlight, what are these informal institutions and how it sort of, relates to economic growth, Professor?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, in talking about the work of Acemoglu and his co-authors, absolutely, he kind of broke wide open this area of research. There's many who've done it conceptually, theoretically. Obviously, Doug North, for example, Mises and Hayek would fall in that category as well. However, Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson, for example, in the paper that you're mentioning, is creating more of the empirical test of those theories. And so that's where it became really fascinating for me as a graduate student to see that we're now capable, whether it's through large data sets or survey data or experiments, for example, to kind of test some of these institutional ideas. And so that's where my paper, Informal Institutions Roles, is that what I'm trying to do is understand, well, property rights are incredibly important, and that's comes out of several different strains of literature, but including the work by Acemoglu and his co-authors. And so how do we get property rights? What's related to secure property rights? And so I started looking at how different cultural norms, or what we would call then broadly informal institutions, may actually secure property better than what we would consider more formal aspects. So typically we think that government has to secure property rights. But when we look at history and we look at governments around the world, they tend to be the biggest extractors of wealth. And so again, with Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson talking about extractive institutions, what they're highlighting is when colonizers went in, they had different incentives depending on where they were and which countries they were in. And if they thought they could successfully settle somewhere, they tended to set up better institutions, more secure property rights, for example. However, in places where they high disease burden, for example, then they would set up extractive institutions. So they would basically just take, so you've got individuals living under them, under the colonizers, who were productive, and the colonizers are coming in and just extracting that wealth. Because of the incentives that they faced. And so what that shows us is that the way in which that we can secure property rights is very different than the way that we typically talk about it in economics. And so that's what I wanted to do in this paper specifically, is to highlight, what are the cultural norms that lead to higher rates of economic development, and does it kind of matter more than formal avenues of doing so. And so through the paper, I looked at how levels of trust matters. So, for example, survey work through the World Values Survey that asked the question, do you think most people can be trusted? And so people that tend to have higher levels of general trust, that tend to respect and tolerate one another, that have less obedience norms, so that you tend to be more entrepreneurial. Those are the countries that we see actually with high levels of economic performance, regardless of what their political institutions look like. So that was the interesting finding in that work, was that as long as you had certain cultural norms, kind of your political arrangements didn't matter as much.
Okay. So this, you talk about trust and, faith in the institutions, sort of mattering, more for entrepreneurial activities, to bloom. So that sort of is impinged by the rules, or that sort of is like, endogenous, like, coming from, like the cultural sort of, thing.
So I think there is definitely coevolution between culture and then your formal roles, and then the formal roles having feedback eventually to cultural norms. We tend to see, at least in the way that we theorize and conceptually talk about measurements of culture, there's good arguments that culture is very slow moving, and the way that we've been able to at least tease out those associations, that culture tends to inform the formal rules. Why the case of colonization and the work, again, of Acemoglu and others is so important is you've got somewhat of an exogenous top-down shock through the colonizers. But, and again, in the way that we can think about the adoption of formal rules, especially in the way that the West grew, and that was somewhat of the process. If you've got cultural norms that then inform your political rules and economic rules. And then there is somewhat of a positive feedback loop under that narrative.
Yeah, Professor Williamson. So, there is this argument made that market and democracy are not necessarily compatible. And another argument is that the tension between, these two are becoming more apparent than ever. So would you buy this assessment, Professor Williamson? Because there is a lot of evidence out there which, do point that inequality of income and wealth has been going in the US and elsewhere too. And so that sort of, is a big, problem and needs looking at it.
So we'll start just talking about the association between markets and the political arrangements, so your political institutions. So we can think we have economic institutions in our political institutions, so the rules that govern an economic system, and then the rules that govern your political system. And so we think about freedom and the economic system, so economic freedom or capitalism, whatever we want to call it, how does that relate to political freedom? And so what you've seen historically, and there's good theory to back this up, is that once your markets become free, you tend to then see more political freedom. And you can think of it as your preferences are changing, you're growing out of a subsistence economy, or you as an individual are increasing your level of income, and therefore, through freer markets, you've been able to do that, and then you want more civil rights, civil liberties, political rights, political liberties. And so that's how we tend to see from a historical perspective, and then also, theoretically seeing the kind of those types of issues discussed, at least in the economics and political science literature. And now I think what you're talking about is some of the issues in democratic countries, such as the U.S. or such as India. And, when you have inequality, whether we measure it through, health or income, however we want to talk about it, how does that, in terms of economic outcomes, affect your political stability? I would argue that I'm less concerned about that, because for one thing, these sorts of issues have always been with us, but we need to really think about what it is that we mean by democracy. And so people are still willing and capable of free elections and voting and expressing their opinions through free speech. That to me is one of the biggest things that underpin political freedom, is the ability to dissent against current leaders, or just discuss ideas, right? So that's really in large part what we're doing here. And so I think that, freedom begets more freedom. And so more economic freedom is going to get you more political freedom.
Yeah.
And that also means, though, talking about or having things emerge that perhaps you personally don't like, which I tend to think is how people think of income inequality.
Yeah.
Not that we're promoting or advocating greater inequality.
Yeah.
It's that we have to understand kind of what it is that we're measuring and what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think Thomas Sowell is a phenomenal economist who has great work on this, that especially in the US, whenever we're talking about income inequality, it's not that it's the same person that's staying in poverty over their lifetime and even through generations. They're moving up the income ladder. And then some people move down the income ladder. And so we've got to think of it. We have these buckets that we measure, but we really need to think about it at the individual level. As long as you have the ability to alter your economic situation, and that you have an idea to start a business, that you can go and do that and profit from it and take care of yourself and your family, then there's nothing wrong with having people at different stages of income. And I think that the measurement of it and the way that we talk about it probably needs to change. But I do understand then that you can see people become frustrated depending on where they are on that income scale, and voice that frustration through the political system.
Yes. So, so how can you voice out, the arguments in a more nuanced way to a socialist that inequality of income is not necessarily bad as the way you see it, but it's actually good for the system in the long run?
I think it depends on what we mean by it, why we would have it, and then trying to understand like the way that we're measuring it. So if you have more than me, we'll just stick to income. If you have more income than me, that doesn't mean that you've harmed me.
Okay. Yes.
And so the process of economic growth means that there's more for everybody.
Yes.
And if you happen to have a bigger slice of the pie than I do, it doesn't mean that you stole something from me.
Yes. Yes.
You're contributing to an overall growing system.
Yes.
And from that, I actually benefit from you having the incentives to be entrepreneurial, for example. You may have, in the end, more income than me, but I have benefited long run from you engaging in those entrepreneurial innovations, for example. And so it's very much shifting away from a zero-sum mentality to a positive sum. That's the beauty and benefit of capitalism. That, I believe, is probably one of the most important points to get across to, say, a socialist or somebody who hasn't quite thought of it that way.
So instead of thinking where the training of the school kids when they're in their formative years helps in the long run, because you actually think like an economist as you grow.
Absolutely. And so again, if we can get people to think more along those lines, then perhaps it's not that income inequality is good or bad. It's just we've defined it in this certain way, and some people at certain points in time will have more, but it is not that they stole it from somebody or they're harming others because they have more.
Yes. Well, the gap between ultra right and left wing is, becoming more, obvious in the US. Would you agree, Professor Williamson? And
I'm not sure. I think at times issues become sensationalized for entertainment purposes. I think that probably we can find at any point in our history issues that have been quite divisive, hard to talk about. And I don't think that's probably much different now. I think it's probably just much more publicized, and the content is more produced and available for people to see. It doesn't mean that the political norm right now is fantastic. I think what you're doing is things that we also need to see more in the US. We need to be able to talk. And that's probably the biggest concern I would have, is not so much a greater gap between a right and left way of describing your political views, but are you capable of sitting down and having conversations with people that maybe, at least at the beginning of the conversation, might not agree with you, but perhaps at the end, you both have changed your mind?
So that sort of, would bring more parity in
Yes.
macro thinking. So that, Professor, brings me to the next question, which is, I believe, one of the most important questions of this dialogue that I'm having with you. The power struggle between U.S. and China, and this is getting a lot of media attention. Would you agree with me, Professor? That
it is getting a lot of media attention, and it is important, and for us to really understand what's happening. I think that one of the things that I would like to just keep it in the back of our minds is when we're talking about a U.S. versus any country, so China, for example, here, what it is that we mean by that. And so in this context, we're talking about the U.S. politicians and kind of at odds or struggling with some of the decisions that's being made by government officials in the Communist Party, so in China.
Yeah.
And so it's not, that the people that live in the US is at odds with people who live in China. And I think that's just always important for us to keep in mind. So the politicians in both countries are, currently having conversations, debates, whether privately or publicly, in terms of things that they don't like that the other is doing. So I think probably a great example of this is the debate around free trade, which has kind of been around forever.
Yeah.
And politicians will see that debate much different than a business owner, for example, would in either country.
Yes. But then there is also, a lot of allegations which the US, pins to China, in the sense that they've actually engaged in a lot of intellectual property theft. And that sort of has had negative implications on, the US, businesses. And so how would you fit US on the one side, which is a free market capitalist economy, and China, which is a one-party autocratic communist country?
When we think about what's happened in China over the last 50 years, they shifted toward freeing up their markets. That's where we saw crazy rates of growth.
Yeah.
And so their political system is not free, and there's just a one party, very much top down, lots of control, lots of decisions that just kind of from a human side we would not like, where it was like that's just awful in terms of decisions that are being made. But that's the political system, that's through the Communist Party, whereas their markets have been freer than what they used to be. That's a huge improvement, and that has improved the lives of the poorest of the poor in China. And so if they keep doing that, which my understanding is the improvements in freeing up their markets has slowed down. So there are still aspects of economic freedom at certain places in China, but at the rate at which they've freed up markets has slowed. And so that is unfortunate. And so that's where the US can be similar. We have free markets in the US. If they have free markets, and from an economic perspective, then we're more similar. Our political systems are vastly different.
Yes.
And so if the US would engage in, some sort of decision or top-down issue that people in the US don't like, we can at least voice that without fear of going missing or other repercussions for our families, for example. So again, having free speech is a huge hallmark of a democratic system, which is largely missing in China. So I do think you're right that that's where a lot of the issues between countries like the US, Western democracies, have issues with China isn't so much, we tend to see the trade wars very much publicized, but we also are confronted with some of the human rights violations that we know are going on, and some of the other lack of civil liberties, lack of being able to express your religious views or views about the political party, that the consequences from that are extreme. And I think that's where people living in the US or in other freer countries have issues with the decisions that get made in China, for example.
Yes. So, Professor, how would you, fit India in this, the power struggle? India, being a democratic country which, mirrors US, economy in the way, the political system is organized here. and that, we are gradually moving, towards being like a free market capitalist, economy. And that sort of is now, I mean, it's evident now, go to any city in India. I don't know whether you have personally been in India. Have you?
I have not.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Okay, okay. But it's actually evident now, the cities, that go to. So how would you fit, the case of India? Because these three are going to be the top three economies, by the end of this decade. China number one, US number two, and, India number three. Yes.
When we, again, just break it down, the economic versus political system, you're right that the US and India's political systems are much more similar. And India's made great strides toward becoming much more free in their economic system. And so, I think that they overall much more align in terms of preferences and, overall goals that both from a political aspect and economic aspect that both countries hope to achieve.
Yeah.
And as long as we keep, working together, trading with one another, having more interactions, you're just going to see kind of more and more of both India and the US kind of sharing in the benefits of a free market system.
Yes, because I bring in India because, we have a large population, which, many say have actually surpassed China's now. And our growth is going to come, a lot of it is going to come from, human capital. China, on the other hand, their growth was sort of driven by, physical capital, right? So, so any institutions, Professor, that, you can think of that matter more, that if, let's say, an emerging market economy such as India's, takes care of, is going to help spur the human capital component, that we have.
I would argue a couple of things. One is, again, just secure property rights. So the ability to start a business as quick and easy as possible, that you have fewest regulations in that sense. So that there's not large bureaucratic hurdles that you have to overcome to be entrepreneurial. So you're right. The investment in human capital in India has been tremendous, and you guys have seen the payoff, and will continue to see that. But then if you can also take advantage of the ideas that the individuals are having because of the increases in human capital. So if you can then capitalize on their entrepreneurial ideas and innovations, and they can test those ideas instead of needing to come to a freer, at least historically freer country like the US or the UK, for example. That leads to my other point about immigration. So if we can have more free immigration, so not just, people from India coming to the US, but people from the US also going to India to, spread their business ideas, or just, just have more interaction between the two countries is going to, again, have payoff beneficial to both sides. And so again, it's not viewing things as zero sum, that everybody can benefit. And
absolutely.
And the more that we can share in those types of systems and have more interaction with each other, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah. And so that, I think, is dependent upon the skill level that you have, because now technology sort of makes it, possible for you to, be collaborating sitting in India.
Correct.
So I'll come to my last question, Professor. Okay. So, and that is that, being, a woman economist, many women are going to, be looking up to you. And I will make this argument. I don't know whether you will agree with this or not, that we need a lot more women economists who are working across all levels. Would you agree with this, Professor?
It's not, I don't necessarily disagree, but I wouldn't, I guess it's trying to understand why women or anybody's choosing the profession that they're going in. And if there's some artificial hurdle or a barrier that prevents women into going into economics, then we need to get rid of it. But, my position is more that people should pursue their comparative advantage. So what they're naturally good at and what they're naturally interested in. I hope it's economics, because I absolutely love it. And I find it fascinating on multiple levels. However,
Yeah.
I understand that maybe other people don't, and that they're better suited to do something else.
Yeah.
So I love seeing other female economists, but I don't think it's necessarily something that is we need more of or we need less of.
Okay. So no, I think because having more female economists will sort of, enrich, how, you look at things, and that sort of will have positive spillovers is what I feel, but I might be wrong here.
I don't think you're necessarily wrong. I think that we have seen women entering into STEM fields, including economics, much more so because there's been a cultural shift, and that is great. So again, if there's something that's preventing a man or a woman from pursuing what they think they would be very good at, that's unfortunate. We need to remove that. I think a lot of where we've seen it, at least in the U.S. with economics and other STEM fields, is more of a cultural bias. And I think that cultural bias is starting to get corrected.
Yeah.
Economics tends to be very math heavy, especially at the graduate level.
Yeah.
And so if women or other minority groups haven't been properly trained in math, if they don't have access to education in which they're properly trained in it, they would then shy away from it. And that to me is very unfortunate. That needs to be remedied.
Yes.
And then we would see, again, we would all be better off from just anybody having more exposure to math and sciences, and especially economics. That I think that when, especially again in democratic countries, so like the U.S. and India, when the general population and citizenry has understanding of basic economics, we're all going to see better policies adopted that continue to support economic growth. That when you have kind of that economic way of thinking and a better understanding of how the world works, and especially the wealth creation process, we're going to then continue to support policies that will promote economic growth.
Yeah, that will push you, to a free market capitalist economy, which is ultimately, what leads to, wealth generation in the long run.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And
I enjoyed it.
Any other last, point that, you might want to make here, Professor?
I think that what you're doing is fantastic. Talking about ideas is one of the most important things that we can do. Again, it doesn't have to just be about economics, but being able to come together and discuss ideas is going to have just, again, I think a hugely beneficial payoff in trying to understand each other and then trying to understand the benefit of free markets.
Yeah. And with that, we hopefully look forward to you visiting India.
I would love that. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you. Take care.
Professor Williamson. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.